The scent of dried thyme and ancient dust carries on the breeze that wanders across the Germush mountains of southeastern Turkey, a landscape where the earth seems to hold its breath in the heat of the afternoon. For thousands of years, this place was known to the local shepherds only as Göbekli Tepe, or the Potbelly Hill, a rounded limestone mound that rose unnaturally from the surrounding plateau. And for those thousands of years, no one suspected that the gentle curve of the hill was not a work of nature, but a shroud of soil intentionally placed to hide a secret of staggering proportions. To look upon these rolling hills today is to see a quiet, semi-arid expanse. But if we allow our minds to drift back 12,000 years, the world transforms into something far more lush and vibrant. We find ourselves in a time before the first furrow was ploughed into the earth, before the first grain of wheat was domesticated, and before the first permanent city was ever conceived. In this distant epoch, the Anatolian Plateau was a garden of wild grasses and oak forests, a hunting ground for gazelle, aurochs, and wild boar. The people who moved through this landscape are often described in our history books as simple hunter-gatherers, nomadic souls whose lives were dictated by the seasons and the migration of herds. And yet, it was these very people who gathered at the Potbelly Hill to achieve the impossible. In the mid-1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at this mound, following the clues of flint chips that littered the surface like fallen snow. Where others had seen nothing more than a medieval cemetery or a natural formation, Schmidt sensed a deeper rhythm beneath the soil. As his team began to peel back the layers of time, they did not find the modest hearths or simple tools they expected. Instead, they unearthed massive, T-shaped pillars of limestone, some standing over 18 feet tall and weighing more than 10 tons. These megaliths were not rough-hewn rocks, but elegantly carved monuments, decorated with high-relief sculptures of lions, scorpions, vultures, and foxes. The sheer scale of the endeavor was breathtaking, challenging everything we thought we knew about the capabilities of our ancestors. These pillars were carved and transported using only stone tools, long before the invention of the wheel, the discovery of metalworking, or the domestication of beasts of burden. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day fall away, perhaps you can imagine yourself standing on that windswept hill alongside those ancient builders. You are in the right place to let these mysteries wash over you. Here at the Slumber Archives, we explore these echoes of the past with new history narrations every single day, created specifically to help you drift into a peaceful rest. If you find these journeys through time comforting, please consider subscribing so you never miss a nightly story, and a simple like on this video helps other weary travelers find their way to our quiet corner of the world. Now let us return to the shadows of the pillars, where the chronology of human civilization begins to unravel. Before the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, the academic consensus was clear and linear. Humans first discovered agriculture, which led to a surplus of food, which then allowed for settled life, and finally, once people were living in permanent villages, they developed complex religion and monumental architecture. It was a neat, logical progression, but the Potbelly Hill shattered that timeline into 1,000 pieces. Radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material, revealed that the oldest structures at the site date back to at least 9,600 years before the Common Era. To put that into perspective, this temple complex was already thousands of years old when the first stones were laid at Stonehenge, and it was ancient history by the time the Great Pyramid of Giza was a mere glimmer in a pharaoh's eye. The stratigraphy, or the study of the layers of earth, showed that this site was built at the very end of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt and intense cooling that gripped the planet as the last ice age fought to maintain its hold. And so, we are left with a profound question that whispers through the trenches of the excavation. Why would a people who did not yet live in houses and who did not yet farm the land dedicate such immense energy to building a temple? It appears that for the people of the Anatolian Plateau, the need to gather to worship and to mark the sacred was not a byproduct of civilization, but the very spark that ignited it. Religion did not follow the city. The temple came first. The pillars themselves are arranged in great circles, their flat tops reaching toward the stars, as if supporting an invisible roof. Many of them feature stylized human arms carved along their sides, with hands meeting over a belt, suggesting that these stones were intended to represent monumental, headless beings. They stand in the silence of the earth, watching over a world that has forgotten their names. As the years passed and the excavation widened, Klaus Schmidt realized that the site was even larger than he had first imagined. Geomagnetic surveys revealed that dozens of these stone circles still lie buried beneath the mound, waiting for their turn to speak. There is a strange, haunting beauty in the realization that we are not the first to contemplate the mysteries of the cosmos from this hill. The people of 12,000 years ago were biologically identical to us. They possessed the same capacity for wonder, for grief, and for artistic expression. They looked up at the same constellations, though the stars would have been in slightly different positions in the sky, and they felt the same chill of the night air. As we peer into the deep time of Göbekli Tepe, we are forced to acknowledge the limits of our own knowledge. We see the carvings of the vultures, birds often associated with the transition between life and death, and we wonder if this was a site of sky burials, where the dead were left to be carried into the heavens. We see the absence of water sources and trash heaps, confirming that this was not a place where people lived, but a place where they travelled from great distances to meet. It was a cathedral in the wilderness, a beacon for a lost world. The enigma of the site is deepened by the way it ended. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, the people who frequented Göbekli Tepe did something inexplicable. They did not abandon the site to the elements. They buried it. With painstaking effort, they filled the stone circles with thousands of tons of rubble and soil, intentionally entombing their work beneath the earth. It is as if they were preserving a memory, or perhaps closing a door on a chapter of human history that they no longer wished to inhabit. And so, the Potbelly Hill slept for 10 millennia, a silent witness to the rise and fall of empires, the birth of writing, and the Industrial Revolution, until a curious archaeologist noticed a cluster of flint on a hilltop. As you drift closer to sleep, let the image of those buried pillars offer a sense of peace. The earth is a vast library of forgotten stories, and though much has been lost to the fog of time, the stones remain, patient, enduring, and heavy with the weight of ages. The winds of the Anatolian Plateau continue to blow, much as they did 12,000 years ago, carrying the same whispers across the limestone. We are merely the latest visitors to this ancient place, looking back through a glass darkly at a civilization that was far more sophisticated, far more organized, and far more mysterious than we ever dared to dream. The story of Göbekli Tepe is a reminder that our journey as a species is not a straight line, but a winding path through the shadows, and that sometimes, to find our future, we must first learn to listen to the silence of the very distant past. Imagine, for a moment, a single flint blade, no larger than a human thumb, held in a hand calloused by the daily struggle of the hunt. This small, sharp sliver of stone was the pinnacle of technology for the people of the early Holocene. And yet, we are asked to believe that with such humble tools they carved the very bones of the earth. For nearly a century, the story of our origins was told with a comfortable, linear certainty. We were taught that the path to civilization followed a strict and logical progression. First, our ancestors discovered the miracle of the seed, learning to domesticate wild grasses like wheat and barley. Once the food supply was secure, they settled into permanent villages. Only then, with the luxury of a full stomach and a stable home, did they find the time to invent complex social hierarchies, organized religion, and the monumental architecture that reflects them. This was the Neolithic Revolution, a tidy, predictable transition from the wandering life of the hunter-gatherer to the settled life of the farmer. But Göbekli Tepe does not fit into this neat box. It stands as a silent stone defiance of everything we thought we knew about the dawn of man. Under the vast, starlit canopy of the Anatolian sky, the ground beneath our feet hides a truth that reverses the traditional narrative. When the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt first began to peel back the layers of dust and time at this site in the mid-1990s, he found something that should not, by the laws of historical progression, exist. He found massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some reaching nearly 20 feet in height and weighing as much as 20 tons, arranged in perfect concentric circles. Through the careful process of radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic material, and the study of stratigraphy, which is the analysis of the layers of earth piled one atop another, it became clear that these temples were built over 11,000 years ago. This puts their construction at least 6,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza and 5,000 years before the first stones were raised at Stonehenge. At this incredibly distant point in time, according to the standard model, there should have been no cities, no organized labor, and certainly no architecture on this scale. The mystery deepens when we consider the people who built it. The archaeological record shows no evidence of permanent houses, no domestic hearths, and most importantly, no signs of agriculture. There are no charred remains of domesticated grains, only the bones of wild animals, gazelle, aurochs, and wild boar, the remnants of feasts enjoyed by people who were still, by all other accounts, nomadic hunters. This realization sends a tremor through the foundations of archaeology. It suggests that it was not the plough that brought us together, but the temple. It was not the need for bread that created society, but a shared spiritual hunger, a collective drive to reach out toward the divine or the unknown. It appears that organized religion was not the byproduct of civilization, but the very catalyst that forced it into being. In order to move these massive stones, to carve the intricate reliefs of vultures, scorpions, and lions that prowl across their surfaces, hundreds of people would have needed to be organized, housed, and fed. They would have needed a reason to stay in one place for years, perhaps decades, working in unison toward a goal that served no immediate practical purpose for survival. As we walk through the mental landscape of this ancient world, the sheer physical reality of the work begins to weigh upon us. Think of the limestone quarries, located hundreds of yards away from the central enclosures. Without the wheel, without beasts of burden like oxen or horses, and thousands of years before the discovery of bronze or iron, these prehistoric builders moved stones that would challenge modern engineers. They used nothing but stone tools and wooden levers to pry these monoliths from the bedrock. The surfaces of the pillars are not merely rough-hewn. They are smoothed and decorated with high-relief carvings that show a profound artistic sensibility. There is a strange, quiet power in the way a stone fox seems to leap from the side of a pillar, or the way a human-like arm, carved into the side of a T-shape, reaches around toward a belt and a loincloth. These are not the crude scratchings of a primitive mind. They are the expressions of a culture with a complex symbolic language, a culture that saw the world as a place filled with spirits, ancestors, and celestial forces. The transition from a world of wandering to a world of stone was likely a slow, agonizing process that stretched across generations. We might imagine the elders sitting around a fire, whispering of the great work being done on the hill, while the younger men and women labored to drag another pillar into place. The air would have been thick with the sound of stone striking stone, a rhythmic, hypnotic clatter that echoed across the Ghermush mountains. As the centuries passed, the site grew. One enclosure would be used, then carefully filled in with earth and rubble, and a new one would be built directly on top or nearby. This intentional burying of the site is perhaps the greatest enigma of all. It is as if the builders were preserving a memory, or perhaps laying a ghost to rest, ensuring that their sacred space would remain undisturbed by the ravages of time and weather. In the silence of the modern excavation, the wind carries the scent of wild herbs and sun-baked earth. Much as it must have done 12,000 years ago, we are forced to confront the possibility that our ancestors were far more capable than we have given them credit for. The Neolithic revolution was not a sudden spark, but a slow-burning fire that was lit long before the first grain was ever sown. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand as sentinels of a forgotten era, challenging us to rethink the very definition of what it means to be civilized. We often think of progress as a steady climb, a ladder where each rung leads us higher toward technology and enlightenment. But perhaps it is more like a tide, rising and falling over the millennia, leaving behind strange and beautiful wreckage on the shores of history. The scale of the project suggests a level of social stratification that we once thought impossible for this time period. To coordinate the efforts of hundreds of workers, there must have been leaders, architects, and perhaps a priestly class who held the vision of the temple in their minds. They would have needed to solve complex logistical problems, such as how to keep a large workforce fed in a landscape that relied entirely on wild resources. This necessity may have been the very thing that pushed them toward the first experiments with farming. Some researchers suggest that the need to provide a reliable food source for the temple builders led to the domestication of einkorn wheat, which still grows wild in the hills nearby. If this is true, then the very birth of agriculture, the foundation of our modern world, was an accidental byproduct of a religious obsession. We didn't start farming because we wanted to change the world. We started farming because we wanted to keep building our monuments to the gods. The deeper we dig into the red soil of the Potbelly Hill, the more the traditional timeline of human history seems to dissolve. We find ourselves in a twilight zone of chronology, where the ghosts of hunter-gatherers build cathedrals in the desert. It is a humbling thought to realize that the people of Göbekli Tepe were as far removed from the building of the pyramids as we are from the fall of the Roman Empire. The stretches of deep time are vast and cold, and much of what we call history is merely the final chapter of a much longer, much more mysterious book. As we linger in this section of our journey, we must allow the old certainties to fade away. We must listen to the silence of the limestone and acknowledge that the story of our species is still being written, and that the most important chapters may have been the ones we forgot we ever lived. The pillars remain, heavy and silent, waiting for us to catch up to the wisdom of a people who saw the world not as something to be conquered, but as a sacred space to be honored in stone. Consider the texture of the stone beneath a steady hand, a surface smoothed by the passage of 12,000 winters and the persistent, gentle abrasion of the Anatolian wind. To look upon the pillars of Göbekli Tepe is to confront a physical impossibility rendered in solid limestone, a silent chorus of giants that have stood watch while the very stars above them shifted their positions in the heavens. These are the T-pillars, the defining signature of this sanctuary, and they are far more than mere supports for a roof that may or may not have ever existed. Each pillar is a monolithic presence, hewn from the bedrock with nothing more than tools of harder stone, flint and obsidian striking against the belly of the earth until the shape of a god or an ancestor began to emerge. When we look closely at these massive shapes, we begin to realize that they are not abstract geometries, but stylized representations of the human form. They are anthropomorphic, a word archaeologists use to describe things that take on the likeness of man. The horizontal capstone represents the head, elongated and featureless, gazing toward a horizon we can no longer see. Along the narrow sides of the vertical shafts, we find arms carved in low relief, bent at the elbows, with long, slender fingers reaching around to meet at the abdomen, just above a carved belt and a loincloth made of animal skin. They have no faces, no eyes to weep, and no mouths to speak. Yet they possess a terrifyingly calm vitality. They stand as silent sentinels, shoulder to shoulder in a circular embrace, as if they are guarding a secret that was never meant to be whispered in the world of the living. The sheer scale of these stones defies our modern understanding of the Neolithic mind. Some of these pillars stand nearly 20 feet tall and weigh as much as 20 tons, a mass equivalent to 5 or 6 adult elephants concentrated into a single block of stone. At the time of their placement, the wheel had not been invented. There were no beasts of burden, no oxen or horses to strain against the weight. There were only the rhythmic breaths of hundreds of people, pulling in unison, guided by a shared vision that outweighed the physical burden of the rock. We must imagine the logistics of the quarry, the sound of stone on stone echoing through the hills as the pillars were slowly pried from the earth and moved across the rugged landscape. It was an act of collective will so immense that it suggests a society far more organized and complex than the simple bands of hunter-gatherers we once imagined them to be. As we move deeper into the enclosures, the artistry becomes even more profound, shifting from the two-dimensional to the three-dimensional, with a grace that seems ahead of its time. On the surfaces of these pillars, an entire ecosystem of the ancient world comes to life. We see leopards tensed to spring, boars with bared tusks, cranes and foxes and scorpions, all rendered with a startling anatomical precision. But it is the high-relief carvings that truly arrest the senses. In some places, a predator, perhaps a lion or a caracal, is carved as if it is crawling down the side of the pillar, its body fully detached from the background, a masterpiece of three-dimensional sculpture created thousands of years before the great civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia had even begun to stir. This is not the crude scratching of a primitive people. It is the work of masters who understood perspective, shadow, and the soul of the animals they depicted. There is a strange, heavy stillness in the way these creatures are arranged. They are often depicted in aggressive postures, guarding the pillars, or perhaps representing the wild forces of nature that the builders sought to negotiate with. We find ourselves wondering what these symbols meant to a mind that saw no division between the physical and the spiritual. Were these totems of different clans, or were they guardians of a threshold, the boundary between the warmth of the campfire and the cold, infinite dark of the night? The limestone holds its peace, offering only the silent testimony of its curves and hollows, and yet the placement of these pillars suggests an even grander ambition, a desire to tether the earth to the movements of the celestial bodies. When we look at the orientation of the enclosures, we see that they were not placed at random. The central pillars of the largest circles appear to be aligned with specific points on the horizon where certain stars would rise or set. Some researchers suggest they were tracking the movement of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, while others look to the constellation of Orion or the slow, rhythmic wobble of the Earth's axis known as precession. The builders were watching the sky with a devotion that bordered on the obsessive, marking the passing of the seasons and the shifting of the ages in a language of stone. They lived in a time of great environmental upheaval, The end of the last ice age was a memory, and the world was settling into a new, warmer rhythm. Perhaps they built these circles as a way to find their place in a changing cosmos, a terrestrial map of the stars that could ensure the sun would always return and the rains would always fall. As the centuries drifted by, the enclosures were not merely used, they were curated. When an enclosure reached the end of its life, it was not abandoned to the elements. Instead, it was carefully and deliberately buried, filled in with thousands of tons of limestone rubble and bone fragments until the pillars were completely submerged beneath the earth. This is why they are so well preserved today. They were placed in a stone sarcophagus by the very people who built them. It is a gesture that feels deeply personal, like the burying of a loved one. Each enclosure was a chapter in a story, and when the chapter was finished, it was tucked away, hidden from the eyes of the future until it was rediscovered in our own time. We are left to walk among these shadows, feeling the weight of the deep time that separates us from the hands that carved these stones. The T-pillars remain as they were, tall, imposing, and utterly indifferent to our modern questions. They do not care for our theories or our carbon dating. They simply exist as a reminder that we were not the first to look at the stars and wonder, and we were not the first to seek immortality in the bones of the earth. The wind continues to move through the valley, carrying with it the faint scent of wild grasses and the dust of a dozen millennia, while the sentinels of Göbekli Tepe stand in their eternal circle, waiting for the next great turning of the world. In the silence of the limestone, we find a mirror of our own search for meaning, a search that began long before the first city was built, in a time when the world was wide and the gods walked among the pillars in the shape of lions and birds. As the light fades over the Anatolian plateau, the shadows of the pillars stretch out across the floor of the enclosures, pointing toward a past we are only just beginning to remember. We realize that the history of humanity is not a straight line, but a series of circles, some buried, some forgotten, and some still waiting to be found beneath the rolling hills of time. The engineering, the art, and the celestial alignments of this place are not just archaeological data points. They are the echoes of a sophisticated human spirit that burned brightly at the very dawn of our story. We are the descendants of dreamers who moved mountains, and as we rest in the shadow of their achievement, we find a strange comfort in the knowledge that even the heaviest stones are part of a much larger, much older dance. Run your fingers, if only in your mind, across the cold, pitted surface of the limestone, and you will feel the heartbeat of a world that has long since vanished into the mist. The silence of the Anatolian plateau is thick, but the stones themselves are far from quiet. They are crowded with a restless, frozen energy, a menagerie of creatures that seem to watch us through the veil of 12,000 years. As we move deeper into the heart of the enclosures, we realize that the people of Göbekli Tepe were not interested in the gentle or the mundane. They did not carve the things that sustained their bodies, but rather the things that haunted their dreams. There is a striking, almost unsettling absence here. In a world where we might expect to see the beginnings of agriculture, we find no images of wheat, no depictions of the plough, and notably, no carvings of the animals we have come to associate with human civilization. There are no docile sheep huddling together, no heavy-lidded cattle, no loyal dogs waiting at the heels of their masters. Instead, the pillars are claimed by the predators. They are claimed by the wild, the untamed, and the dangerous. Look closely at the high-relief carvings, where the stone seems to breathe with the musculature of the beasts. A lion, or perhaps a great leopard, crouches with its teeth bared, its claws extended as if it is about to leap from the pillar and into our reality. Its ribs are visible, suggesting a hunger that is eternal. Nearby, foxes with bushy tails and sharp muzzles skulk across the limestone, their forms captured in a state of perpetual tension. They are followed by boars with tusks like curved daggers and cranes with long, elegant necks that seem to watch the horizon for a change in the wind. But it is the smaller, more venomous creatures that truly command the attention. Scorpions, with their segmented tails arched and ready to strike, crawl across the flat faces of the stone. Spiders spin invisible webs in the negative space between the carvings. And then there are the vultures. These great birds of carrion are depicted with a strange, almost reverent precision, their wings outstretched in a gesture that feels less like flight and more like an embrace of the inevitable. They are the keepers of the threshold, the ones who bridge the gap between the living world and the silent realm of the ancestors. The choice of these specific animals offers us a rare window into the hunter-gatherer psyche, a mindset that existed before the world was fenced and tilled. To these people, the predator was not merely a threat to be avoided, but a powerful spirit to be understood and perhaps even mimicked. There is a raw, visceral quality to the art that suggests a deep respect for the lethal grace of the natural world. The dangerous animal was a mirror, a reflection of the human struggle to survive in a landscape where every shadow held a pair of watching eyes. We see in these carvings a society that was not yet trying to dominate nature, but was instead trying to find its place within a complex, terrifying, and beautiful hierarchy of power. Amidst this wild bestiary, we find symbols that are far more abstract, yet no less intentional. Carved into the belts of the T-shaped pillars and hovering between the images of animals are the H signs. These symbols, two vertical bars joined by a horizontal bridge, appear time and again, carved with a geometric precision that feels startlingly modern. Archaeology, with its careful tools and measured theories, struggles to translate this silent language. Are they depictions of the pillars themselves, seen from above? Are they symbols of the meeting between the earth and the sky? Or perhaps they represent the duality of the human spirit, the bridge between the physical self and the shadow soul. Beside these H signs, we often find intricate net patterns, carved with such delicacy that they look like woven fabric draped over the stone. These nets do not feel like tools for fishing or hunting, but rather like metaphors for the interconnectedness of all things. They are the webs of fate, the invisible threads that bind the fox to the lion, the vulture to the fallen, and the living to the dead. In the quiet of the enclosure, one can almost feel the weight of these patterns. A reminder that even in the deep past, humanity was searching for the underlying structure of the universe, trying to map the invisible forces that govern our lives. The people who gathered here were part of a world we can barely imagine, a world where the boundary between the human and the animal was porous and thin. When they looked at a fox, they did not see a pest. They saw a clever spirit. When they looked at a scorpion, they saw the sudden, sharp edge of mortality. The act of carving these creatures into the very bones of the earth was perhaps a way of anchoring those spirits, of creating a space where the wild could be spoken to, honored, and perhaps even bargained with. It is a testament to a time when the human heart beat in synchrony with the pulse of the wilderness. As we linger in the presence of these stone guardians, we must ask ourselves what it means that the first great monument of humanity was built not for the comfort of the domestic, but in honor of the wild. It suggests that our ancestors were moved by something far more profound than the simple need for food and shelter. They were moved by awe. They were moved by the terrifying beauty of a world that did not belong to them, but which they were privileged to inhabit. The transition from the wild to the domestic is often painted as a steady march of progress. But here, at the dawn of it all, we see that the soul of the hunter was already rich with complexity. The H signs and the net patterns tell us that they were already thinking in metaphors, already seeking a way to represent the abstract concepts of connection and transition. They were not primitive in their thinking, they were merely operating on a different frequency, one attuned to the rustle of grass and the silent glide of a bird of prey. The stones of Göbekli Tepe are a library of the ancient imagination, a place where the stories of the hunt and the mysteries of the night were etched into the landscape for eternity. As the centuries turned into millennia, these carvings would be buried, hidden away from the sun and the wind, preserved in a tomb of earth and rubble. But the energy they represent, the primal fear and the soaring wonder, remains. It is the same energy that ripples through us today when we hear a low growl in the darkness, or see a hawk circling high above in the blue. We are not the first to wonder at the stars, nor are we the first to feel the weight of the unknown. We are simply the latest to stand before these pillars and try to read the script written by our ancestors. The lions and the foxes, the scorpions and the vultures, they are our oldest teachers. They remind us that before there were cities, there were stories. Before there were kings, there were spirits. And before the world was ours, we belonged to the world. As the narrator's voice fades into the soft hum of the evening, let your mind drift back to that ancient hilltop. Imagine the flickers of firelight dancing across the stone, making the carved animals seem to move and breathe in the shadows. Feel the coolness of the night air as it settles over the plateau, and let the mystery of the H signs and the nets carry you into a deep, restful sleep. The predators are silent now, frozen in their limestone vigil, guarding the secrets of a time when the world was young and every stone held a soul. The dance of the hunters and the hunted continues in the quiet chambers of our dreams, a timeless rhythm that connects us to the very beginning of the human journey. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of 1,000 flint blades striking limestone, a rhythmic, metallic clicking that echoes across the Ghermush mountains, softened only by the constant whistling of the wind through the tall grasses. This is the heartbeat of a world that, by all our modern logic, should not have existed. We have long been told that the people of this era were simple wanderers, small bands of nomads following the seasonal migration of gazelle and wild cattle, their lives a precarious balance of survival and movement. But as we stand among the towering pillars of Göbekli Tepe, we are forced to look closer at the hands that carved them. These were the master builders of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, a term archaeologists use to describe a time before the invention of the kiln, before the first clay pot was ever fired. And yet, without metal, without wheels, and without a single beast of burden, they moved mountains. To understand who these people were, we must first unlearn the idea that primitive means unskilled. The hunter-gatherers of the Fertile Crescent lived in a world of staggering abundance, a Garden of Eden that existed before the climate began to shift and harden. The hills were thick with wild almond and pistachio trees, and the valleys were carpeted in vast golden seas of wild einkorn and emmer wheat. They did not need to farm because the earth provided a natural harvest that was nearly infinite. In this landscape of plenty, they found the most precious resource of all, time. With their basic needs met by the richness of the land, their minds turned toward the monumental. They were observers of the stars, masters of stone, and perhaps the first true architects of the human soul. But a project of this scale, a sanctuary of massive T-shaped pillars weighing dozens of tons, requires more than just time. It requires a logistical miracle. Consider the sheer number of bodies needed to quarry these stones from the bedrock, to drag them up the slopes, and to raise them into their sockets. Estimates suggest it would have taken hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people working in unison to complete a single enclosure. This presents us with a profound mystery. In a world without established cities or stored grain, how do you feed a labor force of that size? How do you keep 1,000 workers focused on a singular goal when the very nature of their existence is rooted in the freedom of the hunt? The answer may lie in the debris found scattered around the site. Thousands upon thousands of animal bones. These are not the remains of casual meals, but the remnants of massive communal feasts. We see the bones of wild aurochs, gazelle and wild boar, quantities of meat that suggest hundreds of animals were slaughtered at once to sustain the workers. It seems that Göbekli Tepe was not just a temple, but a destination, a place where different tribes, who might otherwise have been rivals, converged for a shared purpose. They were drawn together by something more powerful than the search for food. They were drawn by a common story, a shared mythology that required a physical anchor in the world. And so, we must consider the social hierarchy that governed such a feat. For a long time, it was believed that human societies were egalitarian, before agriculture, meaning everyone was more or less equal, with no kings or priests to command them. But Göbekli Tepe whispers a different story. To coordinate the carving of a 7-ton pillar, to ensure that every worker is fed and every stone is placed with astronomical precision, there must have been leaders. Perhaps they were shamans, or elders who held the secret knowledge of the stars and the seasons. They were the ones who saw the finished temple in their minds long before the first stone was cut. They were the architects of a social order that predates our oldest histories. A hierarchy born not from the ownership of land, but from the mastery of meaning. As we walk through the dust of the excavations, we realize that these people were living in a transitional state, a twilight zone between the old ways of the forest and the new ways of the field. They were still hunters, deeply connected to the spirits of the animals they depicted on the stones, the leaping foxes, the coiled snakes, and the defiant boars. Yet, they were also starting to settle, to tether themselves to this specific hilltop. The labor required to build these enclosures meant they stayed in one place for months, perhaps years at a time. In doing so, they were inadvertently planting the seeds of our own modern world. They were creating the first public space, a center of gravity that pulled the scattered bands of humanity into a single cohesive unit. The mystery deepens when we look at the precision of their work. These were not rough-hewn rocks tumbled into a pile. The pillars are shaped with a sophisticated understanding of geometry and balance. The surfaces are smoothed and polished, often decorated with high-relief carvings that stand out from the stone, a technique that requires immense patience and a steady hand. These craftsmen knew the soul of the limestone. They knew where to strike and how to listen for the hidden fractures. They worked with a devotion that suggests the act of building was, in itself, a form of prayer. Each strike of the flint was a conversation with the divine, a way to make the invisible visible. Meanwhile, the landscape around them was changing. The era we call the Younger Dryas, a sudden 1,000-year return to Ice Age conditions, had only recently come to an end. The world was warming, the glaciers were retreating, and the people of the Fertile Crescent were finding themselves in a new world. It is possible that Göbekli Tepe was a response to this change, a way to stabilize a world that had once been frozen and chaotic. By building these massive stone circles, they were pinning the earth to the sky, ensuring that the seasons would continue to turn and the gazelle would continue to return. They were no longer just participants in nature. They were beginning to believe they could influence it. The logistics of such a life are staggering to contemplate. Imagine the water carriers moving back and forth from the distant springs, the toolmakers constantly knapping new flint chisels to replace those dulled by the stone, and the storytellers keeping the workers' spirits high as they strained against the weight of the pillars. There must have been a language of construction, a set of signals and commands that allowed a diverse group of people to move as one. This suggests a level of linguistic and cognitive complexity that matches our own. These were not primitive humans in any sense other than the tools they held. Their brains were as large as ours, their emotions as deep, and their capacity for wonder perhaps even greater. For they lived in a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was paper-thin. As the centuries passed, the site grew. New enclosures were built, while older ones were deliberately buried, creating a layered history of devotion that spans over 1,000 years. This constant cycle of building and burying tells us that the process was just as important as the result. The act of gathering, of feasting, and of laboring together was the glue that held their society together. It was a grand experiment in human cooperation, the first time our species decided to leave a permanent mark on the skin of the earth. We are looking at the very moment when the wild human began to become the civilized human, not because they started farming, but because they started dreaming in stone. Think of the silence that must have fallen over the plateau when a project was finished. The workers would return to their wandering lives, carrying the stories of the great stone pillars back to their distant camps. The memory of the feast, the smell of roasted meat, and the sight of the towering stone ancestors would linger in their minds, a shared secret that linked them to every other person who had stood on that hill. They were the first to understand that a place could be sacred, that a specific point on the map could hold the power of the entire universe. As we move deeper into the story of Göbekli Tepe, we must ask ourselves, what did they know that we have forgotten? In our world of steel and glass, we have lost that intimate connection to the raw material of the earth. We see stone as a resource, not a living presence, but for the master builders, every pillar was a being, a sentinel that watched over the passage of time. They built for the long now, for a future they would never see, but one they clearly believed in. Their legacy is not just the stone circles themselves, but the realization that we have always been capable of the impossible, provided we have a reason to gather and a story to tell. The shadows of the pillars stretch long across the excavated pits, reaching out from a past that is 10,000 years older than the pyramids. We are only just beginning to read the language of these stones, to decipher the grammar of their symbols. But even without the words, we can feel the intent. We can feel the pulse of a society that was organized, ambitious, and deeply spiritual. They were the architects of the dawn, the ones who stood at the edge of the old world and dared to build the foundations of the new. And as the night wind sighs through the ruins, we are reminded that we are merely the latest chapter in a story that began with a single strike of flint against stone on a lonely hilltop in ancient Anatolia. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a stone chisel striking limestone in the dead of night, a rhythmic tapping that echoes against the stillness of the plateau. The workers have paused their labor, not because of exhaustion, but because the clouds have finally parted to reveal the velvet expanse of the celestial ocean above. For the people of Göbekli Tepe, the sky was not a distant, empty void. It was a living map, a slow-moving clock of the gods, and perhaps the very blueprint for the stone giants they were raising from the earth. As we stand amidst the circular enclosures today, it becomes increasingly difficult to view these pillars as mere artistic expressions. Many researchers now look upon the site as the world's first true observatory, a place where the movements of the heavens were captured in the permanence of rock. The architects of this place seem to understand that while the earth is subject to the whims of the seasons and the decay of time, the stars offer a sense of eternal order. By aligning their massive T-shaped pillars with specific points on the horizon, they were anchoring their world to the cosmos, ensuring that their rituals were performed in perfect harmony with the turning of the universe. One of the most compelling theories regarding these alignments involves the constellation of Cygnus, the great swan. In the deep past, the stars did not sit in the same positions they occupy today. because of a phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes, a slow, wobbling rotation of the Earth's axis that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete a single cycle. The North Star of 12,000 years ago was not our familiar Polaris. Instead, the celestial pole pointed toward different regions of the sky. Some archaeoastronomers suggest that the central pillars of certain enclosures were oriented to track the setting of Deneb, the brightest star in Cygnus, as it dipped below the northern horizon. To these ancient observers, the Milky Way may have been perceived as a shimmering river of souls, and the constellation of the Swan served as the gateway where the river met the earth. In many ancient traditions, birds are seen as the only creatures capable of traveling between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits, and so, by aligning their temples with the great swan, the builders may have been creating a physical conduit for the dead to ascend into the stars. The pillars were not just supports for a roof, they were fingers of stone pointing toward the path of the afterlife. As the centuries drifted by and the Earth's wobble continued its patient, invisible work, the stars began to shift. A temple that was perfectly aligned one century might find its celestial target drifting out of view the next. This may explain why the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were constantly being modified, rebuilt, or eventually buried. The people were chasing the light, trying to keep their earthly home in sync with the shifting patterns of the night. While some looked to the north, others turned their gaze toward the south, where the brilliant star Sirius, the dog star, began to rise above the horizon during the era when Göbekli Tepe was most active. Sirius is the brightest star in our night sky, and its first appearance after a period of invisibility has heralded the new year and the flooding of life-giving rivers for countless civilizations that followed. It is possible that the very birth of monumental architecture was triggered by the arrival of this new, piercing light in the heavens. Imagine the awe of a people who saw a new star born into their sky, and the Herculean effort they would exert to build a monument worthy of its arrival. This connection between the sky and the earth suggests a level of mathematical and observational sophistication that we once thought belonged only to the much later civilizations of Sumer or Egypt. To track the precession of the equinoxes requires observations spanning generations, a passing down of data and star charts that suggests a long-term intellectual tradition. These were not primitive nomads wandering aimlessly, they were master surveyors of the infinite. They understood that the sky was a mirror, and that by studying the movements above, they could better understand the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth below. In the ancient mind, the boundary between the sky and the underworld was often thin, or even non-existent. The stars were often seen as the campfires of ancestors, or the eyes of deities watching from the dark. At Göbekli Tepe, the presence of vultures carved into the stone, birds that consume the flesh of the dead and carry it toward the heavens, reinforces this link. The site acts as a bridge. Below the ground lies the limestone bedrock, the bones of the earth. Above it rise the pillars, the shadows of men, and above them the rotating wheel of the constellations, the gears of a cosmic machine. As we linger in the silence of the ruins, it is humbling to realize that these people were watching the same stars we see today, yet they saw them with a clarity and a reverence that we have largely lost in our world of electric lights and glowing screens. They lived in a world where the rising of a star could determine the location of a temple, and where the slow drift of the equinoxes was a story written in the very architecture of their lives. The mystery of these alignments reminds us that the history of humanity is not a straight line of progress, but a series of peaks and valleys, of wisdom gained and wisdom forgotten. We are standing in the shadow of a civilization that knew the stars as intimately as we know our own streets, and as the night wind continues to blow across the Anatolian plains, We can almost hear the soft whisper of the ancients urging us to look up, to remember the patterns, and to recognize that we have always been, and will always be, children of the stars. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a single flint blade striking a massive block of limestone, a sharp, rhythmic clicking that echoed across these hills nearly 12,000 years ago. It is a sound that predates the wheel, predates the written word, and predates the very concept of a city. As we move deeper into the heart of the mound, leaving the outer rings behind, we find ourselves standing before the most breathtaking achievement of this lost era. This is Enclosure D, the largest, the most intricate, and perhaps the most sacred of all the structures unearthed at Göbekli Tepe. While other enclosures show signs of repair or simpler craftsmanship, Enclosure D feels like a masterwork, a cathedral of the Stone Age where every surface tells a story that we are only just beginning to translate. The circle is dominated by two central pillars, towering nearly 18 feet high and weighing several tons each. They stand parallel to one another, facing south, like silent sentinels watching over a world that has long since vanished into the dust of the Holocene. But as we step closer, the cold stone begins to take on a strangely human quality. These are not merely pillars. They are stylized beings, anthropomorphic figures, frozen in an eternal stance of prayer or guardianship. If you look closely at the edges of these central monoliths, you can see the faint, elegant carvings of long, slender arms reaching down the sides of the stone. They meet at the front, where delicate fingers clasp together just above a belt. The detail is staggering. There are carved belt buckles, and hanging from these belts are loincloths made of what appears to be fox skin. These figures have no faces, no eyes to meet our gaze, and yet they possess a presence that is almost overwhelming. They represent a bridge between the earthly and the divine, standing atop pedestals that were carved directly out of the living bedrock. To the people who built this, these stones were likely alive, imbued with a spirit that required neither breath nor blood to command the space around them. As we stand within the curve of the surrounding wall, the atmosphere changes. The walls of Enclosure D are composed of smaller stones and mortar, forming a perfect circle that hugs the central giants. There is a peculiar quality to the air here, a stillness that seems to amplify the smallest sound. Modern researchers have noted the strange acoustic properties of these circular limestone chambers. In a world without the hum of electricity or the roar of engines, the sounds produced within these walls would have been transformative. A low chant, a rhythmic drumbeat, or even the steady breathing of a group of people would have resonated through the limestone, vibrating in the chests of everyone present. It is easy to imagine the low, guttural hum of a ritual filling this space, the sound bouncing off the curved surfaces and spiraling upward toward the stars, creating a sensory experience that blurred the lines between the physical world and the realm of the spirits. Set into these surrounding walls are the mysterious porthole stones, large flat slabs with a perfectly circular hole carved through their center. These were not windows for looking out, but rather gateways for moving through. Some archaeologists believe these holes allowed the light of specific stars to pierce the darkness of the enclosure at certain times of the year, while others suggest they were used for ritualistic passage. Perhaps the shamans of the younger Dryas, that cold, turbulent period of Earth's history following the last ice age, passed offerings through these openings, or perhaps they believed the souls of the ancestors could travel through these stone apertures to join the living in their ceremonies. Each porthole is a threshold, a boundary between the known and the unknown, carved with a precision that defies our understanding of the tools available at the time. The sheer scale of Enclosure D forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to settled civilization. Standard history tells us that complex architecture only follows the invention of agriculture, that once people had a surplus of food,
they had the time and organization to build monuments, but Göbekli Tepe turns this timeline on its head.
There is no evidence of domesticated grain here, no signs of permanent housing or farmed animals. Instead, it seems that the urge to worship, the need to gather and mark the sacred, was the primary catalyst. It was the temple that came first, pulling people together from hundreds of miles away, forcing them to innovate, to collaborate, and to feed a workforce of hundreds. The spiritual hunger of these people predated their physical hunger for settled life. Every animal carved onto the pillars of Enclosure D, the snarling predators, the scorpions, the soaring cranes, seems to be part of a complex symbolic language. They are not merely decorations, they are guardians of a story. Some researchers suggest these figures are astronomical markers, representing constellations that have shifted their positions over the millennia due to the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. If this is true, then Enclosure D is not just a temple, but a vast stone book, an archive of celestial knowledge preserved for thousands of years beneath the soil. The effort required to carve these reliefs using only stone tools is almost unfathomable. It speaks of a devotion that transcends the simple struggle for survival, a collective vision that saw the world not just as a place to find food, but as a map of a much larger cosmic reality. As the wind brushes against the rough texture of the limestone, we are reminded of the incredible passage of time. These stones stood in the open air for centuries, witnessed the changing of the seasons and the shifting of the heavens, before they were purposefully and carefully buried by the very people who built them. Why would a culture invest so much labor into a masterpiece only to hide it away? Perhaps the burial was a ritual in itself, a way of planting the temple back into the earth, or perhaps they were protecting something they knew was coming to an end. Whatever the reason, the act of burying Enclosure D preserved it in a state of near perfection, allowing us, 12,000 years later, to step into their sacred circle and feel the weight of their presence. We are left to wonder about the hands that polished these T-shaped pillars until they were smooth to the touch, and the minds that calculated the exact placement of each stone. There is a profound humility in standing here, realizing that our ancestors were not primitive or simple, but were possessed of a sophisticated understanding of geometry, masonry, and the movements of the universe. They lived in a world of shadows and firelight, yet they reached for the infinite with a clarity that we often struggle to find in our own crowded age. The silence of Enclosure D is not an empty silence. It is a silence filled with the echoes of 1,000 questions, a quiet testament to the enduring human spirit that has always sought to build something that would outlast the stars themselves. Imagine, if you will, a single snowflake falling upon a landscape that had only just begun to breathe. For thousands of years, the great ice sheets of the north had been in retreat, pulling back their frozen skirts to reveal a world of lush grasslands and wandering herds. The earth was warming, the climate was stabilizing, and for the people of the Stone Age, life was perhaps becoming a little more predictable, a little more kind. But then, roughly 12,800 years ago, the air turned brittle. The warmth vanished almost overnight, replaced by a cold so profound and so sudden that it felt as though the very breath of the world had been snatched away. This was the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a 1,000-year winter that descended upon the planet with the weight of a falling mountain. In the blink of a geological eye, temperatures plummeted by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in some regions, plunging the northern hemisphere back into the depths of a glacial age. For those living in the Fertile Crescent, the world they knew simply dissolved. The forests withered, the lakes shrank into salt pans, and the great migrations of animals, the lifeblood of the hunter-gatherer, began to falter. It was a time of absolute, grinding environmental stress, a period of climatic chaos that should, by all rights, have broken the human spirit. And yet, it is precisely within this window of catastrophe that we find the origins of Göbekli Tepe. Modern science, through the study of ice cores and sediment layers, calls this a sudden cooling event. But there are those who look at the stones of the Tepe and see a much more violent story. They point to Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, the famous vulture stone, and they see not just a collection of animals, but a celestial ledger of doom. Among the carvings of scorpions and serpents, there is a curious arrangement of symbols that some researchers believe represents a star map of the ancient sky. At the center of this narrative is the theory of a comet strike, a fragmenting giant from the torrid meteor stream that slammed into the Earth's atmosphere, igniting wildfires across continents and throwing enough dust into the stratosphere to blot out the sun for a generation. The vulture stone may be a memorial, a silent witness carved in limestone to ensure that the day the sky fell would never be forgotten. On its surface, a headless man rests at the bottom, perhaps signifying the mass loss of life, while a vulture balances a circular orb on its wing, a symbol, some argue, of the very sun, or perhaps the comet itself as it transitioned from a bringer of light to a harbinger of shadows. If this theory holds true, then Göbekli Tepe was not merely a temple or a gathering place. It was a response to a cosmic trauma. It was a fortress of culture built against the encroaching dark, a way for a fractured people to make sense of a universe that had suddenly turned hostile. When we look at the stratigraphy, the layers of earth and debris that archaeologists carefully peel back like the pages of a dusty book, we see the struggle of these survivors written in the soil. The younger Dryas forced a radical shift in how humans interacted with their environment. As the wild grains became scarce in the cold, dry air, the people could no longer simply wander and take what they needed. They had to stay. They had to protect the few remaining pockets of fertility. They had to cooperate on a scale never before seen in the story of our species. It is a haunting thought that the greatest architectural achievement of the ancient world was perhaps born not of abundance, but of desperate necessity. As the years passed and the cold deepened, the builders of the Tepe labored on. One can almost feel the biting wind whipping across the Germish mountains as they hauled those massive T-shaped pillars into place. Why go to such lengths? Why expend so much precious energy when food was scarce and the future was uncertain? Perhaps because in times of great catastrophe, the human mind craves order. When the natural world becomes a place of terror and unpredictability, we turn to the stone. We turn to the permanent. We turn to the stars. By mapping the movements of the heavens upon these pillars, they were perhaps trying to reclaim a sense of control over the elements, seeking a rhythm in the cosmos that the earth had lost. The environmental pressure of the younger Dryas acted like a crucible, melting away the old ways of life and forging something entirely new. Before this cooling, humans lived in small, fluid bands. After it, we see the first inklings of settled society, the first experiments with agriculture, and the first massive communal projects. Göbekli Tepe stands at the very pivot point of this transformation. It is the bridge between the old world of the wanderer and the new world of the builder. The site suggests that we did not become civilized and then decide to build temples. Rather, the need to build temples, the need to gather and find meaning during a time of global collapse, is what forced us to become civilized. And so, we find ourselves contemplating the resilience of those who came before us. They lived through a period of extreme climatic chaos that would likely collapse our modern infrastructure in a matter of months. They watched the forests die and the ice return, yet they did not retreat into the darkness of the caves. Instead, they climbed the highest hill they could find and raised stones that weighed 20 tons. They carved their stories with such precision and such devotion that even 12 millennia of burial could not erase them. They were a people of the transition, standing between the golden age of the Paleolithic and the dawn of the Neolithic, holding a line against the extinction of their culture. Meanwhile, the mystery of the comet strike continues to ripple through the halls of academia. While some geologists find evidence of nanodiamonds and platinum layers in the Earth, telltale signs of an extraterrestrial impact, others remain skeptical, pointing to volcanic eruptions or shifts in ocean currents as the cause of the younger Dryas. But to the silent watchers at Göbekli Tepe, the cause may have mattered less than the effect. Whether the fire came from the sky or the cold rose from the sea, the result was a world changed forever. The pillars remain, their surfaces worn smooth by the passage of deep time, serving as a quiet testament to the enduring human spirit that has always sought to build something that would outlast the stars themselves, even when those stars seem to be falling. The silence that hangs over the site today is the same silence that must have followed the initial shock of that ancient winter. It is a heavy, contemplative quiet. As you listen to the wind rustling through the dry grass of the Anatolian Plateau, you are hearing the same sound the builders heard as they looked out over a landscape that was becoming a desert. They were the survivors of a forgotten apocalypse, the keepers of a flame that refused to go out. They took the trauma of their age and transformed it into art, into geometry, and into a legacy that we are only just beginning to decode. As we move forward in our journey through the layers of the Tepe, we must keep this backdrop of catastrophe in mind. Every carving, every enclosure, and every deliberate burial of the site was an act of will against a backdrop of environmental ruin. The people of the younger Dryas were not primitive shadows. They were a sophisticated, determined, and deeply spiritual society that faced the end of their world and chose to leave a mark that would endure for all of time. They remind us that even in the coldest winters of human history, the urge to create, to understand, and to remember is the one thing the ice can never truly touch. The stone does not merely sit in the earth. It breathes with the intent of those who shaped it, carrying a silent frequency that speaks of a fundamental shift in the way the human mind perceived the universe. Before the first pillar was ever quarried at Göbekli Tepe, the world was a place of spirits that resided in every stream, every gust of wind, and every flickering shadow of the forest. This was the age of animism, a time when humanity lived as a horizontal layer within the natural world, equal to the wolf, the cedar tree, and the eagle. But as the heavy limestone of the Potbelly Hill began to rise toward the stars, that flat horizon of the soul started to tilt. A new architecture of the spirit was being born, one that reached upward, creating a vertical hierarchy that would eventually define every civilization to follow. Imagine the silence of the Anatolian Plateau 10,000 years ago, broken only by the rhythmic clinking of flint against stone. From the high ridges, one could see small groups of travelers moving across the landscape, navigating by the landmarks of rivers and the slow rotation of the constellations. They were not coming from a single village or a local camp. Evidence suggests these pilgrims traveled from hundreds of miles away, crossing rugged terrain and swollen rivers to reach this specific limestone plateau. Göbekli Tepe was not a city, nor was it a farm. It was a regional hub, a magnetic center for tribes who otherwise lived in isolation. It was a place where the scattered fragments of humanity gathered to weave their individual stories into a singular, grander tapestry of existence. As these diverse groups converged, the old ways of the solitary hunter began to evolve. In the flickering light of great fires, the role of the shaman, the one who walks between worlds, began to crystallize into something more structured. We are witnessing, in these silent ruins, the emergence of the first priests. These were the keepers of the calendar, the masters of the stone-cutting craft, and the navigators of the celestial cycles. They were the ones who understood that to control the stone was to control the narrative of life and death. The transition was subtle but profound, shifting from a world where spirits were everywhere to a world where divinity was concentrated in specific sacred spaces. The temple was no longer just a place to visit. It was the axis mundi, the center of the world, where the earthly and the divine were tethered together by massive T-shaped anchors. The pillars themselves tell the story of this psychological evolution. In the earliest layers of the site, the carvings are wild and chaotic, a riot of scorpions, lions, and serpents that seem to leap from the rock. They represent the raw, untamed power of the natural world that the younger Dryas hunters knew so well. But as we move through the centuries of the site's use, the carvings change. The figures become more stylized, more symbolic, and more human-like. The T-shaped pillars are not just supports for a roof. They are anthropomorphic beings. They have arms carved in low relief, hands meeting over their bellies, and belts cinched around their waists. They are giants of stone, standing in a circle, silent and eternal. This reflects a monumental change in the human soul. For the first time, we were seeing ourselves reflected in the divine. We were no longer just another animal in the brush. We were the builders, the creators, the ones who could command the very bones of the earth to stand upright. This was the birth of the sacred as a structured concept. The people of Göbekli Tepe were beginning to see the universe as a place of order, a place where humans held a unique and perhaps terrifying responsibility to maintain the balance between the earth and the sky. The architecture was a mirror, reflecting a mind that was becoming increasingly complex, increasingly obsessed with permanence in a world that was constantly changing. In the quiet of the evening, as the shadows of the pillars stretch across the dust, one can almost hear the echoes of the rituals that once took place here. These were not the simple prayers of a lone traveller, but organized ceremonies involving music, feasting, and the collective movement of hundreds of people. The site required a massive amount of coordination, a logistical feat that implies a social hierarchy we once thought impossible for hunter-gatherers. Someone had to feed the workers, someone had to design the enclosures, someone had to interpret the movements of the stars to ensure the pillars were aligned with the cosmic clock. This social complexity was the crucible in which the modern human identity was forged. The us and them of small tribal units began to dissolve into a larger we. By sharing a sacred space, these disparate groups created a shared history and a shared destiny. They were building more than just stone circles. They were building the foundations of human cooperation. And yet, there is a haunting quality to this progress. As the priests rose in status and the rituals became more elaborate, the gap between the common person and the divine began to widen. The mystery was becoming a secret, held by those who knew the songs and the stories etched into the limestone. We often wonder what these people felt as they looked upon their work. Did they feel a sense of triumph, or a sense of mounting dread as the environment around them continued to shift? The younger Dryas, that long, cold snap that gripped the world, must have felt like a judgment from the very spirits they were trying to appease. Perhaps the grandeur of Göbekli Tepe was a desperate plea to the heavens, an attempt to bargain with the forces of nature through the sheer scale of their devotion. The evolution of the soul is often driven by crisis, and in the face of a dying landscape, the people of the Plateau reached for the eternal. As the centuries passed, the site became a palimpsest of human belief. Older circles were filled in and new ones were built on top, each generation adding its own layer of understanding to the stone. It was a continuous conversation with the ancestors, a way of ensuring that the wisdom of the past was not lost to the winds of time. The very act of burying the site, which we discussed previously, might have been the final ritual in this long spiritual journey, a way of returning the sacred to the earth, sealing the memory of a golden age before it could be tarnished by the coming era of agriculture and ownership. The enigma of Göbekli Tepe lies not just in how it was built, but in why it was abandoned. As the first seeds of wheat were gathered and the first herds of sheep were penned, the old gods of the hunt began to fade. The priests of the stone circles found their influence waning as a new kind of power emerged, the power of the harvest. The transition from the sacred wild to the sacred field was perhaps the most significant turning point in our history, and Göbekli Tepe stands as the silent witness to that crossing. It is the bridge between the world of the spirit and the world of the hand, a place where we first dared to dream of something greater than our own survival. Now, as we look back across the gulf of 12,000 years, we see these pillars not as cold monuments, but as the first stirrings of the modern mind. They represent the moment we stopped simply reacting to the world and started trying to explain it. Every cathedral, every mosque, every temple that has ever been built traces its lineage back to this dusty hilltop in Turkey. We are the children of the stone movers, the descendants of those who looked at a mountain and saw a god waiting to be released. The weight of these forgotten ages is heavy, but it is a weight that gives us our shape. The air grows still as we contemplate the depth of this history. The transition from animism to organized religion was not a single event, but a slow tectonic shift in the human psyche. It was a journey from the many to the one, from the fleeting to the permanent. And as we wander through the ruins of our earliest sanctuary, we realize that the questions they asked are the same questions we ask today, staring into the same stars, wondering about our place in the vast, unfolding mystery of time. The stone remains, patient and unmoving, waiting for us to remember what we once knew so well. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of this ancient landscape is not how it began, but how it ended. Imagine for a moment the silence of a high plateau, where the wind carries the scent of wild grasses and the distant cry of a hawk. Underneath your feet, buried beneath layers of limestone dust and carefully placed stones, lies a secret that defies the typical logic of human progress. We are accustomed to the idea of cities falling to ruin through the slow erosion of time, or perhaps through the sudden, violent fires of war. We expect to find the remains of a civilization scattered by the elements, their grand monuments eventually toppled by the patient roots of trees or the shifting of the earth. But Göbekli Tepe did not fall. It was put to sleep. Around 8,000 years before the Common Era, the people who had gathered here for generations made a decision that remains one of the greatest enigmas of the prehistoric world. They did not simply walk away from their sanctuary. They did not leave it to the mercy of the wind and the rain. Instead, with a precision that mirrors the effort it took to build the site, they began to fill it in. They brought in massive amounts of fill, a mixture of limestone rubble, flint chips, and the bones of wild animals. And they poured this debris into the enclosures, bucket by bucket, stone by stone, until the towering T-shaped pillars were completely submerged. The very icons they had carved with such reverence were swallowed by the earth, hidden from the light of the sun and the gaze of the stars. This process of decommissioning was not a hasty act of desperation. It was a meticulous, deliberate burial. Archaeologists have noted that the fill is relatively clean, lacking the organic waste usually found in ancient trash heaps, suggesting that the material was brought there specifically for the purpose of entombment. It is as if they were creating a time capsule, though for whom we cannot say. By covering the pillars in this artificial hill, they protected the carvings from the ravages of weather, preserving the sharp edges of the stone and the intricate details of the animals for over 10,000 years. The site became a mountain of their own making, a belly of earth that held their gods in a state of suspended animation. As we contemplate this intentional burial, we must wonder why a culture would choose to hide its greatest achievement. In our modern world, we strive for permanence and visibility. We build our monuments to be seen, to endure as witnesses to our existence. Yet at Göbekli Tepe, the act of concealment seems to have been as sacred as the act of creation. Some theorists suggest that the site had reached the end of its spiritual lifespan, its rituals no longer resonating with a changing world. Perhaps the burial was a way of killing the temple, a funeral for a place of power that had served its purpose. Others wonder if the burial was a protective measure, a way to keep the sacred ground safe from a perceived threat or a coming shift in the climate that they sensed on the horizon. Whatever the reason, the transition that followed marks a profound decline in the architectural ambition of the region. As the massive, circular enclosures were being filled with earth, a new style of building began to emerge on the higher levels of the mound. These later structures were smaller, humbler, and distinctly rectangular. The grand, freestanding pillars that once reached toward the sky were replaced by much smaller supports, often built directly into the walls of the rooms. The artistry became less refined, the scale less intimidating. It was as if the spark of monumental inspiration had begun to flicker and fade. The transition from the massive circles to these cramped, boxy spaces suggests a shift in focus, from the communal and the cosmic to the domestic and the practical. In these later layers, we see the first tentative steps toward what we would recognize as a settled village life. But there is a haunting quality to this progression. Usually, we expect to see technology and art improve over time, moving from the simple to the complex. Göbekli Tepe tells the opposite story. It begins with a masterpiece and ends with a footnote. The people who lived in these rectangular houses were walking over the buried heads of giants, perhaps unaware of the scale of the world that lay just a few meters beneath their floors. They were living in the shadow of a greatness they no longer possessed the means, or perhaps the desire to replicate. As the centuries rolled on, the knowledge of what lay beneath the mound of the Potbelly Hill drifted into the realm of myth, and then, eventually, into total silence. The artificial hill became a natural part of the landscape, a place where local farmers might find a strange piece of flint or a fragment of worked stone, never suspecting that they were standing on the oldest temple in the world. This deliberate act of burial is the reason we are able to speak of Göbekli Tepe today. Had it been left exposed, the limestone would have dissolved, the carvings would have smoothed into nothingness, and the pillars would have crumbled under the weight of the millennia. The burial was an act of preservation through destruction. By ending the life of the site, they ensured its immortality. It remains a silent witness to a time when humanity's relationship with the earth and the divine was fundamentally different from our own. As we peel back the layers of fill, we are essentially unearthing a memory that was meant to stay forgotten. Every bucket of earth removed by modern excavators is a reversal of an ancient ritual, a slow awakening of a giant that has been sleeping in the dark for 10,000 years. And so, we are left to walk through these excavated hollows, feeling the cool air that has not touched these stones since the end of the last ice age. We see the transition in the stone, from the wild, soaring imagination of the hunter-gatherers to the grounded, restricted world of the early farmers. It is a reminder that history is not always a steady climb upward. Sometimes we reach a peak, a moment of extraordinary clarity and power, only to turn away from it and descend back into the familiar valleys of the mundane. The buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand as a testament to that peak, a reminder that our ancestors once reached for the stars with a strength we are only just beginning to understand. In the quiet of the evening, when the archaeologists have gone and the dust begins to settle, One can almost feel the weight of those thousands of tons of earth pressing down. It is a heavy, patient silence. It is the silence of a secret kept for 100 centuries. We are the first generation to see these carvings in 10,000 years, and as we look into the eyes of the stone foxes and the rearing snakes, we cannot help but feel that we are intruders in a tomb that was never meant to be opened. The mystery of why they buried it remains as solid and impenetrable as the pillars themselves, a riddle wrapped in the very soil of the earth. As the years passed, the landscape changed. The lush forests receded, the herds of gazelle grew thin, and the nomadic way of life that had birthed this sanctuary began to dissolve into the structured, repetitive toil of agriculture. The grand enclosures were gone, hidden beneath the feet of people who were learning to plant seeds and domesticate animals. The age of the hunter-priests was over, and the age of the farmer had begun. But deep underground, the pillars remained, held fast in their earthen embrace, waiting for a time when the world would be ready to remember them once more. The transition was complete, the old world was interred, and the long, slow journey toward our modern civilization had truly begun, built upon the foundation of a forgotten dream. For a long time, we imagined the hills of southeastern Turkey held only a single secret, a lone lighthouse of stone standing against the fog of the deep past. We looked at the circular enclosures of Göbekli Tepe and saw a miracle, an impossible anomaly that seemed to have materialized out of the dust without a predecessor or a peer. But as the wind sweeps across the high plateaus of the Taurus Mountains, it carries the scent of disturbed earth and the echoes of a much larger story. Beneath the scorched yellow grass of the Harran Plain, the ground is beginning to speak again, revealing that Göbekli Tepe was never a solitary temple. It was merely the most famous member of a vast, interconnected family. Archaeologists now speak of a network they call the Tars Tepele, or the Stone Hills. It is a constellation of at least 12 different sites, all dating back to that same shadowy window of the 10th millennium before the Common Era. As we map these locations, the landscape begins to transform from a barren wilderness into a vibrant, pulsing cultural map, a region where thousands of people were moving, building, and thinking in ways we are only just beginning to comprehend. These hills were not empty. They were a hive of human expression, a spiritual geography where every ridge and valley seems to have held a specific meaning to the hunter-gatherers who wandered them. Among these silent sentinels, Karahan Tepe has emerged as perhaps the most haunting and evocative. Located just 30 miles to the east of its more famous sibling, Karahan Tepe sits perched on a rugged limestone ridge, overlooking a horizon that has changed very little in 11,000 years. When you walk among its unfinished pillars, you feel a shift in the atmosphere. While Göbekli Tepe feels grand and liturgical, Karahan Tepe feels intimate, strange, and deeply visceral. Here, the stone does not just stand in abstract T-shapes. It begins to breathe with the likeness of man. The most striking feature discovered at Karahan Tepe is a chamber carved directly into the living bedrock, a space that feels more like a womb than a building. Inside this subterranean room, the ancient builders did something that challenges our entire understanding of their artistic evolution. They carved a massive, three-dimensional human head protruding from the rock wall. It is a face of startling intensity, with a prominent nose, thick lips, and deep, hollow sockets that once might have held eyes of obsidian or polished bone. This face does not look up toward the stars. It stares directly across the chamber toward a series of phallic pillars, 11 of them, standing like a petrified forest within the dark earth. The craftsmanship is so precise, the intent so clear, that it forces us to reconsider the emotional lives of these people. They were not just surviving the aftermath of the younger Dryas, that 1,000-year cold snap that had gripped the world in ice. They were thriving in a world of complex symbolism. The head at Karahan Tepe suggests a focus on the human form, perhaps an ancestor or a deity that feels distinct from the animal-heavy imagery of Göbekli Tepe. It is as if, in this corner of the stone hills, the focus of the mystery was shifting from the wild beasts of the plains to the spark of consciousness within the human mind itself. As we look closer at the layout of Karahan Tepe, we see evidence of rituals that were designed to be experienced in a specific sequence. There are narrow channels carved into the rock, possibly for the flow of liquids, water perhaps, or something more ceremonial, and small windows that allowed the light of the rising sun to penetrate the darkness at specific times of the year. The entire site feels like a theatre of the soul, a place where initiates might have crawled through narrow passages to emerge into the presence of that great stone face. It is a reminder that we are not looking at the beginning of anything, but rather the flowering of a culture that had likely been developing its myths for thousands of years before the first stone was ever quarried. This realization that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated miracle changes everything we thought we knew about the 10th millennium. It suggests a regional culture, a shared language of stone and spirit that spanned hundreds of miles. Imagine the social organization required to coordinate such a feat. These were not small, wandering bands of 20 or 30 people. To build 12 such sites simultaneously, there must have been a sophisticated network of communication, a shared calendar, and a way to feed and house the thousands of workers who labored under the sun. They were trading obsidian from the volcanic peaks to the north, seashells from the distant coasts, and ideas that were even more precious. The Tastapella network tells us that the Neolithic revolution, the transition from hunting to farming, was not a sudden discovery of seeds, but a long, slow-burning fire of social change. It suggests that people did not settle down because they learned to farm. They learned to farm because they had already decided to stay. They stayed for the temples. They stayed for the ancestors. They stayed because these hills had become sacred ground, a place where the barrier between the living and the dead was thin. The agriculture that followed was merely a way to sustain the massive gatherings that these holy sites demanded. And so, we find ourselves standing on the edge of a vast, submerged history. For every pillar we have unearthed at Karahan Tepe, or Harbetsuvan, or Sayburç, there are likely hundreds more still sleeping beneath the sediment. We are looking at a lost world of the 11th millennium, a time when the earth was warming, the mammoths were fading into memory, and a new kind of human consciousness was carving its mark into the limestone. It is a world of shadows and whispers, where the lines between the hunter and the priest are blurred beyond recognition. The regional culture of the Stone Hills was one of immense ambition. They were moving stones that weighed many tons, shaping them with nothing but harder stones and infinite patience. They were decorating their world with foxes, vultures, and serpents, creating a visual language that we can see but cannot yet read. And in the center of it all, at places like Karahan Tepe, they were beginning to look at their own reflection in the rock, carving the human face into the very bones of the earth. As the evening light fades over the Turkish highlands, the silhouettes of these ancient mounds remind us of how much remains hidden. We are only just beginning to scratch the surface of this megalithic enigma. We thought we had found the beginning of the story at Göbekli Tepe, but it turns out we have only found a single page in a much longer, much more complex book. The landscape is crowded with ghosts, and as the archaeologists continue their slow, rhythmic work, the map of our origins continues to expand, reaching back into the dark, into the silence of the hills, where the first architects of our world are still waiting to be known. Consider, for a moment, the humble grain of wheat, a thin,
swaying stalk of grass that seems almost insignificant against the backdrop of the massive T-shaped pillars and the weight of the limestone hills. Yet, within the golden kernels of these wild grasses lay a power more transformative than any stone tool or carved totem. For decades, the narrative of human history followed a straight and predictable line. We believed that humans first learned to farm, and only once they had a surplus of food and a settled life did they find the time and the collective will to build great temples. We thought the bread came before the prayer. But Göbekli Tepe has turned this logic on its head, suggesting instead that it was the spiritual hunger of our ancestors that drove them to reinvent the very way they survived on this earth. Deep within the genetic code of modern wheat, scientists have found a silent witness to this transformation. By tracing the DNA of the grain we eat today back through the millennia, researchers have identified its wild ancestor, a variety known as einkorn wheat. And remarkably, the genetic heart of this ancient grain beats most strongly in the wild grasses that still grow on the slopes of the Karahan mountains, a mere 30 miles from the ruins of the temple. It is a staggering realization that the very first seeds of the agricultural revolution were likely gathered and sown in the shadow of these megalithic circles. The map of our modern world, with its sprawling cities and vast industrial farms, finds its center point here, in a quiet patch of Turkish hillside, where a hunter-gatherer first reached down to harvest a handful of grass. The transition was not a sudden discovery, but a slow and perhaps reluctant necessity. Imagine the scene thousands of years ago. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people gathered at the site to move the great stones, to carve the intricate reliefs of vultures and foxes, and to participate in the rituals that bound their world together. Such a massive undertaking required a gargantuan amount of food. The traditional way of life, wandering the plains in small bands, gathering wild fruits and hunting gazelle, could no longer sustain a concentrated workforce of this scale. To keep the temple alive, the people had to find a way to make the land produce more than it ever had before, and so they began to tend the wild patches of grain. They cleared the weeds, they saved the largest seeds, and they waited. They were tethered to the site by their faith, and in that tethering they became the first farmers. It is a haunting thought that the rise of agriculture was not a triumph of human ingenuity over nature, but a desperate response to the needs of a monument. We often view the birth of farming as a great leap forward, a liberation from the uncertainty of the wild. But for the people living through it, it may have felt like a closing of doors. The hunter-gatherer lived in a world of endless horizons, moving with the seasons, possessing a deep and intimate knowledge of thousands of plants and animals. Their diet was diverse, their bodies were strong, and their time was their own. When they stepped into the furrowed field, they traded that freedom for a life of grueling, repetitive labor. They bent their backs to the earth. Their diets narrowed to a few starchy staples, and they became vulnerable to the whims of the weather and the blight of the crop. As the centuries drifted by, these first seeds grew into something much larger than a food source. They became the foundation of a new kind of human existence. The need to guard the grain and manage the land led to the concept of ownership, of mine and thine. The temporary seasonal camps of the temple builders hardened into permanent villages, and those villages eventually swelled into the first city-states. The egalitarian circles of the hunter-gatherers, where every voice held weight, began to flatten into hierarchies. There were now those who owned the land, those who worked it, and those who stood atop the temples to interpret the will of the gods who demanded such labor. The agricultural revolution was a trap that once entered could never be escaped, for as the population grew on a diet of grain, there was no longer enough wild game to go back to the old ways. We can almost hear the echoes of this transition in the very stones of Göbekli Tepe. The later enclosures are smaller, the pillars less grand, the carvings less masterful. It is as if, as the people became more successful at farming, their connection to the raw, wild power of the temple began to fade. Or perhaps the burden of maintaining the new social order left little room for the soaring ambitions of their ancestors. The city-state brought with it the plague, the tax, and the wall, comforts of a kind, but purchased at the cost of a certain primal liberty. We are the children of that bargain. Every time we walk through a crowded street or sit down to a meal, we are participating in a system that began with a handful of wild einkorn near a temple that time forgot. The mystery of Göbekli Tepe is not just in how it was built, but in what it did to us. It stands at the exact threshold where the old world died and the new world was born. It suggests that our obsession with the sacred, our need to build something that outlasts our own brief lives, is what truly defines us. We did not build the temple because we were settled. We settled because we had to build the temple. In the silence of the Anatolian night, one can almost feel the weight of those 12,000 years. The long, slow march from the forest to the field, from the dream to the stone. The first seeds were planted in a world of spirits and shadows, and as they took root, they grew into the civilization we see today, a vast, complex machine that still, in its quietest moments, looks back toward the hills, wondering what it was that we left behind in the tall grass. The geometry hidden within the dust of the Potbelly Hill is not a mere accident of placement, but a silent testament to a precision we once thought impossible for the era. When we look at the layout of the three oldest enclosures, labelled by archaeologists as B, C, and D, we find a ghost in the machine, a deliberate mathematical blueprint that suggests the builders were working with a sophisticated understanding of spatial relationships long before the invention of the compass or the written word. If one draws a line connecting the center points of these three circular temples, they form a nearly perfect equilateral triangle. This is not the work of wandering bands of foragers acting on a whim. It is the manifestation of a complex architectural plan, a mastery of geometry that predates the great pyramids of Giza by 7,000 years. We are forced to consider that these people possessed a mental map of the world that was far more advanced than our history books have ever dared to suggest. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Göbekli Tepe is what it implies about the nature of lost knowledge. We tend to view human progress as a steady, upward climb, a ladder where each rung is more stable than the last. But the stones of Anatolia suggest a different story, one of peaks and valleys, where profound insights into the structure of the universe were attained, refined, and then inexplicably allowed to slip away into the earth. What other philosophies were whispered into the wind during those 12 millennia? What systems of measurement, what celestial observations, and what intricate mythologies were woven by the hands that carved these limestone pillars? We see the physical remnants, the heavy blocks and the fierce animals, but the software of their culture, the thoughts that gave these stones meaning, has been erased by the relentless passage of deep time. It is a shadow history, a ledger of human achievement where the most important pages have been torn out and scattered. As the years passed and the site was eventually buried, it became a tomb for more than just stone. It became a repository for what geneticists and historians sometimes call ghost lineages. These are the forgotten branches of the human family tree, the cultures and peoples who left no DNA in the modern population and no written records in the soil. They were the pioneers of the mind, the first to grapple with the monumental task of organizing the world around them into something sacred. They existed in a space between the old ways of the Ice Age and the coming dawn of the Bronze Age, a bridge made of limestone and imagination.
When we walk among the ruins, we are walking through the echoes of a civilization that was once as vibrant and certain of its future as our own, yet they have vanished so completely that even their name for themselves is lost. They are a reminder that the majority of the human story has happened in the dark, beyond the reach of our lanterns. There is a profound humility to be found in the stratigraphy, the layers of earth and debris, that covers these pillars. Archaeologists have noted that as the centuries wore on, the craftsmanship at Göbekli Tepe actually seemed to decline. The oldest enclosures are the largest and most sophisticated, while the later circles are smaller, the carvings less refined, until eventually the entire site was intentionally backfilled with rubble and abandoned. It is a reversal of our standard narrative of progress. It suggests that there was a golden age of understanding that slowly faded, a slow dimming of the light until the knowledge of how to move these great weights was forgotten entirely. We are left to wonder if we are currently living in a similar peak, or if we are merely the stewards of a different kind of forgetting. The site humbles us by showing that we are not the first to strive for the infinite, nor are we the first to fail at preserving the secrets we worked so hard to uncover. In the quiet of the Anatolian Plateau, the realization begins to settle in that we know very little about our own origins. We are like children who have found a single page from a massive ancient book and believe we understand the entire plot. Göbekli Tepe is that page, and it is written in a language we are only just beginning to decipher. It challenges the very definition of what it means to be primitive. If a people who had not yet mastered pottery or the wheel could coordinate the labor of hundreds to create a celestial clockwork of stone, then our understanding of human potential must be radically expanded. We are looking back at a version of ourselves that was deeply attuned to the rhythms of the earth and the movements of the stars, a version of ourselves that saw no distinction between the physical and the spiritual. As we contemplate the geometry and the lost technologies of this site, we must also confront the fragility of our own legacy. The builders of the enclosures likely believed their work would stand forever, providing a permanent home for the spirits of the wild. And in a sense, they were right. The stones did survive, but the context, the why behind the how, has been scoured away by 10,000 winters. We find ourselves standing before an enigma that refuses to be solved by radiocarbon dating alone. It requires a different kind of listening, a willingness to accept that the ancestors were not just our predecessors, but our equals in intellect and our superiors in their connection to the unseen world. The shadow of history is long, and it covers much more than it reveals. For every site like Göbekli Tepe that we happen to stumble upon, how many more lie beneath the rising seas or the shifting sands of the Sahara? How many other revolutions of thought have occurred in the deep past, only to be swallowed by the earth? The site is a reminder that we are a species with a very short memory. We live in the house our ancestors built, but we have forgotten the location of the foundation stones. We walk over the bones of giants and call it common ground, but beneath the surface the geometry remains. The triangles, the circles, and the pillars continue to hold their positions, waiting for a time when we might finally be quiet enough to understand what they have been trying to tell us for 12,000 years. Meanwhile, the wind continues to move across the ridges of the Taurus Mountains, carrying with it the same scent of wild grasses and dust that the builders would have known. The stars that align with the pillars still burn in the cold vacuum of space, indifferent to the rise and fall of the empires below. There is a strange comfort in this continuity, a sense that even if we lose our way, the stones will remain as a waypoint for whoever comes next. The enigma of the Potbelly Hill is not just a puzzle for archaeologists to solve, it is a mirror held up to the human soul. It asks us to consider what we are building today that will be worth remembering 10,000 years from now, and what knowledge we are currently losing without even realizing it. As the night deepens over the excavations, the outlines of the T-shaped pillars seem to soften, merging with the shadows of the hills. They stand as silent sentinels at the edge of our understanding, guarding the entrance to a past that is far more complex and mysterious than we ever imagined. We are not the first to look at the moon and wonder about our place in the cosmos. We are not the first to seek meaning in the alignment of the world. We are simply the latest in a long, unbroken chain of dreamers, trying to leave a mark on a world that is constantly moving, constantly changing, and constantly forgetting. The stones of Göbekli Tepe are the anchor for that dream, a heavy, limestone weight that keeps us from drifting too far from the truth of our own beginning. Today, the wind still sweeps across the Germish mountain range, carrying with it the fine, pale dust of the Anatolian Plateau, just as it has for over 11,000 years. But now, the silence of the hills is met by the soft tread of visitors from every corner of the globe, as Göbekli Tepe has taken its place as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a title that feels almost too modern, too small, for a place that predates the very concept of a world heritage. The site is protected now by a sweeping, futuristic canopy, a great white wing that shields the delicate limestone carvings from the harsh sun and the rare driving rains. Beneath this shelter, the enclosures of Layer 2 and Layer 3 sit in a perpetual twilight, their T-shaped pillars standing like silent sentinels, watching over a secret that is only beginning to be told. It is a humbling thought to realize that what we see today, these 4 great stone circles that have redefined our understanding of human history, represent only a tiny fraction of what lies beneath the earth. Archaeologists and historians, working with a patience that mirrors the slow passage of the ages, estimate that more than 95% of the site remains unexcavated. The vast majority of this temple complex is still cradled in the dark, cool embrace of the hillside, tucked away in the artificial mound that was built by hands we will never hold. We are standing on the very tip of a chronological iceberg, looking down at a few exposed stones, while a city of spirits remains buried beneath our feet. The work of bringing this past into the light has changed since the days when the first shovels bit into the dry earth. We no longer rely solely on the physical labor of digging to see through the veil of time. Modern technology has given us new eyes that can see through the soil without disturbing a single grain of sand. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR, a method of using pulsed laser light to map the contours of the earth, have revealed a subterranean landscape far more vast and complex than anyone had dared to imagine. These scans show dozens of other enclosures, some even larger than the ones already revealed, still waiting in the deep silence. There are hundreds of pillars yet to be touched by the sun, their carvings of lions, foxes, and snakes still sharp and pristine, protected by the very earth that was meant to hide them forever. As the years pass, the focus of the mission at Göbekli Tepe has shifted from a frantic search for answers to a solemn duty of preservation. There is a profound responsibility in managing what many now call the 0 point in time. Each stone that is uncovered is a page from a book that has no duplicate, a singular record of a moment when humanity first began to reach for the divine. If these stones were to crumble, or if their context were lost to the rush of modern curiosity, a vital link in the chain of our existence would be severed. And so, the archaeologists move with a measured grace, choosing to leave much of the site undisturbed for future generations. They understand that perhaps, in 100 years or 1,000, those who come after us will have even better tools, and perhaps a deeper wisdom, to interpret what the ancients left behind. Meanwhile, the mystery of the site's intentional burial continues to haunt the edges of every conversation. Why did they cover it all? Why spend centuries carving these magnificent totems only to systematically fill the enclosures with thousands of tons of clean fill and refuse? Some suggest it was an act of mourning, a way to lay a sacred era to rest once its purpose had been served. Others wonder if it was a desperate attempt to protect their most holy place from a coming cataclysm or a changing world that no longer respected the old ways. Whatever the reason, this act of burial is the greatest gift the builders could have given us. By hiding their work, they ensured its survival, creating a time capsule that remained airtight and untouched, while empires rose and fell, while languages were born and forgotten, and while the very stars shifted in the sky. The ongoing excavations are not just about finding more pillars or more carvings. They are about finding ourselves in the deep strata of the past. Every basket of earth removed is a step backward through time, past the invention of the wheel, past the birth of writing, past the first domesticated grain of wheat. We are looking for the moment when the hunter became the dreamer, the moment when the struggle for survival was joined by the need for ceremony. It is a slow, methodical process that requires a certain kind of stillness, a willingness to listen to what the stones are saying in their long limestone sleep. And as we look toward the future of Göbekli Tepe, we are reminded that we are merely the current custodians of a legacy that belongs to the ages. The site challenges us to think in terms of deep time, not in years or decades, but in millennia. It asks us what we will leave behind that could possibly stand for 11,000 years. Will our steel and glass endure as long as their limestone and flint? Will our stories be told by those who find our ruins in the distant future? Or will we leave only dust and silence? The stones do not answer, but they provide a mirror. In their weathered surfaces, we see the reflection of a humanity that was always more capable, more spiritual, and more connected than we ever gave them credit for. The work continues, one grain of sand at a time, as the sun moves across the Turkish sky and the shadows of the T-shaped pillars grow long and thin. The mystery remains largely intact, a vast and beautiful enigma that invites us to keep searching, to keep wondering, and to keep dreaming of the hands that carved the world out of the mountainside. We are not the first to stand here, and if we are careful, if we are wise, we will not be the last to find peace in the presence of these ancient, waiting giants. The silence of the limestone plateau is not a hollow thing. It is heavy, dense with the weight of 12,000 years of accumulated stillness. As the air cools and the wind dies down to a soft, rhythmic sigh, the pillars of Göbekli Tepe seem to settle deeper into the earth, as if they are finally exhaling after a long day of holding up the sky. These stones have watched the stars drift across the heavens for 144,000 moons, witnessing the slow, agonizing turn of the cosmic clock, while the rest of humanity forgot they ever existed. They stood in darkness when the last of the Ice Age glaciers retreated into the north, and they remained shrouded in dust as the first great cities of Mesopotamia rose and fell in the distant valleys. There is a profound continuity in this silence, a thread that connects the modern observer to the ancient architect through the simple, shared experience of standing beneath the vast, flickering canopy of the Milky Way. We often imagine the past as a series of disconnected events, a sequence of dates and names carved into the pages of a textbook. But here, amidst the enclosures of the Potbelly Hill, time feels more like a circle than a line. The same constellations that guided the hands of the hunter-gatherers still wheel overhead, casting the same faint silver light upon the carved surfaces of the foxes, the cranes, and the scorpions. When we look at these pillars, we are looking at the very first attempt by our species to anchor itself to the divine, to create a permanent place of belonging in a world that was otherwise wild and unpredictable. It is a quiet, humbling realization to know that the human spirit has not changed all that much in 12 millennia. We still seek meaning in the patterns of the stars. We still feel the need to build something that will outlast our own brief flicker of life. and we still find ourselves standing in awe of the mysteries that lie just beyond the reach of our understanding. The T-shaped giants do not offer up their secrets easily. They stand like sentinels at the edge of a dream, their limestone faces worn smooth by the passage of eons, but their presence as commanding as the day they were first raised from the bedrock. We might wonder what those ancient people thought as they finished the final carvings on Pillar 18 or Pillar 43. Perhaps they felt a sense of completion, a belief that they had bridged the gap between the earthly and the eternal. Or perhaps they knew, even then, that they were merely passing through, leaving behind a message for a future they could never truly imagine. The intentional burial of the site suggests a deep, collective desire to protect something precious, to tuck the temple away into the safety of the earth like a seed waiting for a spring that would not come for 10,000 years. And so, the hills held their breath, preserving the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and stone, so that we might one day find the path back to our own beginnings. As the night deepens, the shadows between the enclosures grow indistinguishable from the stones themselves, and the site becomes a landscape of soft edges and half-remembered shapes. There is a rhythmic quality to the darkness here, a slow and steady pulse that seems to emanate from the very ground. It is the pace of deep time, a scale of existence where a human life is but a single heartbeat, and the rise and fall of civilizations are merely the shifting of the tides. In this space, the anxieties of the modern world begin to dissolve, replaced by a sense of belonging to something much older and much larger than ourselves. We are part of a long, unbroken lineage of dreamers and builders, a chain of consciousness that stretches back into the misty dawn of the Holocene. The megaliths are not just monuments to the dead, they are markers of the living, proof that even in the harshest of times the human mind was capable of conceiving beauty and order on a monumental scale. The enigma of Göbekli Tepe does not require an answer to be felt. In fact, there is a certain peace in the not knowing, a comfort in the realization that the world still holds wonders that defy our logic and challenge our assumptions. We do not need to solve the puzzle to appreciate the craftsmanship of the stone tool marks or the elegance of a high-relief leopard frozen in mid-leap. These details are enough to remind us that we were not the first to love this land, nor were we the first to find solace in the shadow of the mountains. The pillars stand guard over a history that is still being written, one grain of sand at a time, and as the earth continues its slow rotation, they remain as they have always been, patient, enduring, and profoundly still. There is a gentle power in the way the ruins occupy the landscape, neither demanding attention nor fading away entirely. They exist in a state of perpetual waiting, a bridge between the world that was and the world that is yet to be. As we allow our thoughts to drift alongside the cool night air, we can almost hear the echoes of the ancient ceremonies, the rhythmic chanting, the shuffling of feet on the stone floors, the crackle of fires that once illuminated these very carvings. Those sounds are gone now, replaced by the soft hoot of an owl or the rustle of dry grass in the breeze, but the essence of the place remains. It is a sanctuary of memory, a place where the passage of time feels less like an ending and more like a long, slow transition into a different state of being. The stars continue their silent march across the obsidian sky, tracing the same paths they took when the younger Dryas was a living memory, and the world was waking up from its long, icy slumber. The pillars, too, remain in their places, their limestone structures absorbing the coolness of the night, waiting for the first touch of dawn to reveal their shapes once more. But for now, there is only the dark and the peace that comes with it. There is the knowledge that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, that our story is much older than we were taught, and that the earth remembers everything we have forgotten. The stones are the keepers of that memory. the silent witnesses to the first great awakening of the human soul. And as the hours stretch toward the morning, the weight of the past becomes a soft blanket, a heavy and comforting presence that invites a quiet, dreamless rest. The mystery of the megaliths does not vanish in the dark. It simply becomes part of the night, a quiet truth that does not need words to be understood. We are not the first to seek comfort in the stillness of the plateau, and we will not be the last to find ourselves humbled by the enduring legacy of those who came before. The world turns, the stars shift, and the pillars stand, eternal sentinels in a landscape of dreams. Let the mind wander back through the centuries, past the empires and the wars, past the inventions and the discoveries, until you reach that high, lonely hill in Anatolia. See the pillars standing in the moonlight, their T-shaped forms reaching up toward the heavens, just as they did 12,000 years ago. Feel the cool stone beneath your hands and the soft earth beneath your feet. There is nothing left to solve tonight, nothing left to prove. There is only the quiet, the darkness, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the ancient world. The giants are at rest, and so may you be, drifting into the long, peaceful shadow of history, where the secrets of the past are kept safe by the stones and the stars. The passage of time is a river, and we are merely floating upon its surface, carried along by currents we cannot see toward a horizon we cannot yet know. But here, at the beginning of the story, the water is still and deep. The megaliths are the anchors that hold us to the shore, reminding us of where we started and how far we have come. As the night air grows even colder and the silence even deeper, let the image of the temple fade into the soft grey of a dream. The foxes and the vultures, the lions and the snakes, they all return to the stone, merging with the shadows until they are one with the hill. The enigma remains, a beautiful and ancient song without an end, echoing through the halls of time. Rest now, in the presence of the waiting giants. Let the weight of the ages pull you down into a deep and effortless sleep, where the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe are no longer questions to be answered, but truths to be felt. The stones will be there when the sun rises, just as they have always been, watching over the world with a patient, stony gaze. But for now, the world is dark, the air is still, and the story is complete. Sleep beneath the stars, sleep in the shadow of the pillars, sleep in the heart of the ancient mystery.